Good day and welcome to another edition of Crapper. Today it's just me, I'm afraid. Peter and Shaun are busy this week, um, and we're going to do another group discussion next week, or yeah, thereabouts. Um, but in order to, you know, keep the conversation going, I thought maybe I'd do a quick monologue, as it were, about an album that might not normally come up in the context of my conversations with them. And so this week I thought I would look at uh, Queen One, as it's now been renamed. Um, this is a new release by Queen, and they've reimagined their first album and released it as a box set. And so I thought it might be a good moment to go back to the early days of Queen and discuss Queen in general. Um, I think that this is it's been fun for me to go back this morning to listening to the first album by Queen, which I haven't heard for a very long time. There's various things to say about it. I think that it's obviously not a famous Queen album, or a particularly well remembered one, but that doesn't make it any less interesting, to talk about. Um, Although that might be a starting point for the conversation because um, I think the fact that it's um, not a famous album and not a particularly well remembered album is not an accident because we're dealing with a phase here in the career of Queen in which they haven't yet written a breakthrough single or even necessarily a breakthrough song. And yet, on the other hand, a lot of the Queen idiom, as it were, is already in place. So they're already using a lot of their gimmicks, as it were, right? Uh, their famous selling points are already present in terms of sound and things, but they haven't yet managed to quite crack the formula to the point where they're writing something that is worthy of general public attention, let's say. So I think that moment probably comes with Killer Queen, I would say, um, which is on Sheer Heart Attack, I think, which is their third album. And yeah, because I don't think they did have a sort of hit single before that, which was Seven Seas of Rhye, which we'll talk about later on. Um, the single version is not on this album, although a version of it is on this album. Um, but that didn't split the world in two, as Nietzsche would have put it. Um, I think that moment came, at least in the British context, with Killer Queen, which was an amazing song and a big hit, and you know is continuous with the material that's on, for example, this first album, in the sense that, as I said before, like stylistically, that it has a lot in common with the stuff that they've already done on the first couple of albums. But it completely universalizes their sound and their style to the point where, the general public in Britain, at least, are starting to pick up on it and really like them. I mean, I think that, to speak personally for a moment, I've always thought that Queen are really, when they're at their best, they're completely amazing. Like almost like no one can touch them. Um, when they, as we say, when they're good, they're very, very good, and when they're bad, they're horrid. I think that applies here because I think that when they're not at their best, they're often doing material which is quite weak and sort of so mannered as well as being weak, that it's not particularly pleasant to listen to, at least from my point of view. Um, and so I think that that's why Queen albums are often a slightly ambiguous affair. Whilst, for example, Queen's greatest hits, which is their collection, the singles collection, um, which came out I think in 1980, if I'm not mistaken, and went straight to number one in the UK, is a completely amazing record, because it's got their best stuff, and their best stuff is so good that it's one of those greatest hits albums that sort of stands apart from the rest of the catalogue of the band. It seems to me. Once again, just to remind you, I am speaking from my own. I'm just giving my opinion here. Uh, Perfectly welcome to disagree, of course. Um, they do so. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of their albums in general. I think that my favorite is probably A Day at the Races, which I think is an amazing record, and I think that it really all came together on that one. I think Jazz is a pretty good record as well. And I think some of the later records they did were actually pretty good as well. But I'm not, for example, a huge fan of A Night at the Opera, because I think whilst it's got a couple of brilliant tracks on it, you know, obviously Bohemian Rhapsody, Bo Rap being the most famous, You're My Best Friend being the other, which were both singles. I find the rest of it quite weak. I mean, personally, I don't. Again, all the styles are kind of interesting, but it's so sort of stylistically mannered, and yet I find some of the writing subpar. That the combination of those two things just kind of winds me up, and I couldn't really listen to that record. But um, yeah, so occasionally they did a good album. This first album probably isn't one of them, um, for reasons that we'll get into, but mainly for the reason I've already set out, which is that it's not particularly, it doesn't have any hits on it, and in that sense, they've yet to, have a sort of breakthrough moment. Although it does have some very good stuff on it, which I'll explain. Um, I think the other thing, couple of things I would say perhaps is, yeah, we wouldn't normally cover an album like this because it's not really related to prog so much. Although this does really have a lot of prog elements. Not that Queen have ever been considered a prog band. Um, but what it does really have very strongly, as well as some prog elements, I think is some sort of proto heavy metal elements. I mean, Queen are a very hard rocking band, and that's made clear again already on this album. Um, the guitar sound is extremely distorted at certain points, and it's very, hard rocking. Some of the tracks are, particularly the Brian May stuff. I think if I were to talk about the individual members, I would say that, just for a moment, I would say that for me, Freddie Mercury is already the star here. Um, and I mean, his main competition in terms of songwriting at this point, of course, is Brian May. At this point, the albums were sort of written half and half between them. They don't really do joint credits on songs, Queen. So songs are credited either to one person or another, and most of them are on this album. I think are Freddie Mercury tracks, but half or nearly half are Brian May tracks. Same on the second album. It's one Roger Taylor track, because Roger Taylor and John Deacon start to write tracks later on. But Roger Taylor's already, of course, starting to write things, and later on he did some amazing stuff, Roger Taylor, as did John Deacon. At this point, he's just got one track on the album. So basically, we're dealing with an oscillation between Freddie Mercury and Brian May. And for my money, Freddie is really the standout talent at this point. And as I say, Brian May did great stuff later on, and I think his guitar playing is amazing, and all that stuff is really present right from the start. But I think that his songs are not, for my taste, they're not quite up to scratch yet. They sort of work formally as songs, but they don't really grab my imagination or my intellectual attention at this point. I think perhaps, as I said before, I think that probably it's not unfair to say that he comes into his own more as a songwriter later on from A Day at the Races onwards. Although he does have some nice rock tracks before that point. I think Brighton Rock is a good track, for example, on the third album, Sheer Heart Attack. But anyway, at this point, as I say, the Brian May stuff is not quite as interesting as the Freddie Mercury stuff. And Freddie's got some really great tracks on this album, I think, as I'll explain shortly. Since Shaun's not here, I'll take the liberty of not really talking about the cover. Although I do, there was one thing I wanted to mention on the cover is that I remember seeing it as a young lad. And it's very it had a big impact on me. I was very young, like 9 or 10 or something, because it's very gender bending, right? Which was something that we, perhaps wasn't so used to at that time as now. There's a sort of I think there's a sort of a queer sensibility on the album cover, and in some of the themes that they write about and sing about. And so there's a sort of queer performativity element in the cover, I think, of this track, some cross-dressing and things like that. I'm kind of going from memory here because I haven't actually got a copy of the album on me. But yeah, I do wonder to what extent people were aware of that at the time, and people found that shocking. I mean, maybe it was sort of the glam era, I suppose. So maybe it was more normal than one might think. There was a sort of, I think, kind of like a gender bending element in David Bowie, wasn't there? David Bowie's sort of the Bowie imaginary, and Roxy Music as well, I suppose. Although I think Roxy Music were just also starting off at this point, so that's probably a bad example. But anyway, I think that was something I wanted to mention on the cover in terms of, as I say, the sort of the group imaginary. Let's go on to talk about the tracks. I think that the first track, Keep Yourself Alive, is a Brian May track. I think that it's sort of probably the best Brian May song on here. And as I say, it's sort of the best one to date and for quite a while. So in that sense, it's a good lead song. And the sort of guitar sounds lay down a template, I think, for everything that comes next. So in that sense, it's a good lead song. It's still not a great song for me, I have to say. I don't like his songs really on this album or on the second album. The first half of Queen 2 is basically written by Brian May, and the second half is written by Freddie Mercury. And I think the first half of Queen 2 is quite weak, and the second half is great, I think, of Queen 2. But we'll talk about that maybe another day. So I can see why this is a sort of paradigm track for the early Queen sound, because it's got a lot of trademarks. May already has this amazing guitar style, which is unique, unlike anybody else. But as I say, it's not really my favorite song from the band at this time. It's got some interesting, in terms of like trademarks. Rather than just talking about the guitar sound, it might be interesting to mention, I suppose, the fact that it's got some sort of, there's an attempt to do something harmonically interesting here on this track, I think. It's sort of harmonically sophisticated, let's say. It's full of like modulations and things like that. It keeps changing key, which isn't a guarantee of success. I mean, doing something interesting doesn't mean that you're doing something interesting, if you catch my drift. And for example, there's on the chorus, the end of the chorus, "Maybe all your time and the money and keep me satisfied." That bit, there's an interesting contrary motion in the harmony, and it almost sounds like, I think it sounds like he's playing the piano at this point rather than the guitar, because it's almost like he's thinking in terms of two hands doing different things, interesting counterpoint, which sort of seems to indicate, again, a slight classical sensibility, which is omnipresent in Queen, as anybody who's ever spent 5 minutes listening to them will know. It also has this track, that last line of the chorus, "Lend me all your time and your money, keep me satisfied." That bit, the way the harmony works puts me in mind of sort of musicals, or even like musical um, style, which is more autochthonous to Great Britain. I suppose you could even sort of say like the operetta style or the opera style, um, which is again like a famous Queen idiom. Um, so they're trying to do some interesting things here stylistically, but I don't. Again, I repeat, I find it slightly boring. The sum total, um, and I think that the total is less than the parts, let's say, and I don't think that. I think it's an indication that they haven't quite come into their own yet. Um, there's also, by the way, a drum solo at the end, which I think is totally unnecessary. Um, Apparently, Roger Taylor was a very well thought of drummer at the time, but I tend to think he's a better musician than he is a drummer. Because you've got to be a good musician to write a song like Radio Gaga. Um, and he's a solid drummer, I suppose. See, we need Shaun to have these sort of conversations because he's the drum expert. Um, but yeah, it's like they've gone, let's have a drum solo at this point, and he's just gone doodle 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 doodle. But it doesn't add much to the song at all. Let's say that's the most charitable thing I can say about it. Um, Moving on. Track two is Doing All Right. It's called Doing All Right. Um, Again, I think the chords are slightly. I mean, I would say the same about this track as I would say about the first track. The chords are slightly interesting, slightly sophisticated. I think there's a diminished chord somewhere in the main harmony. Um, but again, it's sort of to little end, really. This isn't exactly what I would call a classic. I think the middle bit is quite fun. They keep stopping and starting. Um, and there's something quite proggy about that, I think. There's time changes, and then there's a sort of raucous, hard rocking section in the middle. I mean, the rock section is really off the hook. It's really proto metal stuff. Um, if a little bit, again, a little bit harmonically predictable, because da 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 da. I mean, you could almost just come up with that in about four, as long as it took you to play it. So again, it's like we're going for mood here rather than compositional interest, let's say. Um, but I do like the fact that they've decided to put a contrasting section to stop and just go into a complete contrasting section right in the middle, because I always think that's quite a bold compositional maneuver. It's a bit like when Genesis say, um, what is it? A flower, and then they go into Willow Farm in the middle of Supper's Ready. Uh, all change. I think that's quite fun. Um, Slightly makes me, for some reason, the middle bit of this song, Doing All Right, slightly reminds me also of the Strawbs, a band we may well come back to. Um, there's a middle bit in the first track on Beyond the Witchwood. Oof, I'm having to go from memory here. I think it's a glimpse of heaven, I think it's called. And there's a Rick Wakeman keyboard flourish in the middle, which has the same harmonic structure as this track actually, and it's a really nice little contrast. And I get a similar feeling when I'm listening to this track. But once again, it's sort of structurally interesting, but I don't really feel like it's saying much. It's got much to say. I think basically, I think that Brian May was still finding his feet as a composer at this point. I think that's the best way to say it, because he is someone that it's difficult not to admire musically, I think. Let's move on to track three, Great King Rat. Now, this for me is where the album really starts. I think this is the first Freddie Mercury track, and I think this track is brilliant. It's I mean, as I say, it's in contrast to May, it shows to me that Freddie's already knows what kind of thing he wants to achieve in the music field. Um, it's a very complex structure, as are most of his tracks on this album. And this, I mean, he really brings the prog here, Freddie Mercury. Um, and I'm here for it, as they say. Um, I think it's a like the mood of the song is nice, but what happens is what really interests me about it in the first instance is when he goes into the chorus. The Great King Rat. The Great King Rat was a bloody old man. A bloody old man was he, which is a very sort of like traditional English type of phrase. Um, so there's already something classical about this. Classical in the sort of general sense. I mean, I think that bit, the Great King Rat, which is the last line of the chorus, I think is sort of a sort of triumphantly exciting development. It's so unexpected, but it works so well. And I think that the cowbell arrangement, which I presume was written by Roger Taylor on that bit, it's a beautiful touch. That it's a brilliant touch. And I think this bit can almost, like if you're a Genesis fan like I am, this could almost be like almost like a Genesis track. Uh, in fact, I read that one of the few companies that actually were interested in signing Queen, because there wasn't many, was Charisma, who already had Genesis. And apparently, even though Queen didn't have many options at that point, they turned them down. And the reason why was because they didn't want to be in the shadow of Genesis, they said. I didn't realize Genesis cast such a long shadow at that point, but I suppose this was already in, I suppose, 72, 73. So maybe Genesis was starting to become famous at that point. But to me, it's an interesting thought experiment. What would Queen have sounded like if they'd been on Charisma? Whether they would now be considered part of the prog movement rather than a sort of I don't know what do people consider Queen to be? Kind of camp, classical, hard rock uh, ensemble, whatever that is. Um, yeah, so that's a great bit, and in fact, the bit building up to it as well. Um, wouldn't you like to know? Wouldn't you like to know that bit? I'm just improvising the tune, so I can't even remember what they are, but that sort of bit. It's got really interesting chords on it. And the Great King Rat line is a lovely resolution to it. Anyway, this is I just love it's I'm hooked at this point, right? Um, and then, as I say, it's a very complex structure. And as the album goes on, I started to realize, listening back to it, actually how complex all of these structures are, particularly on the Freddie Mercury tracks. Um, this track has got a strident time change in the middle, and which is again unexpected and kind of interesting. Then it breaks down into a sort of almost Steve Howe style acoustic guitar section. I think there's a Yes influence here as well, not to mention Genesis. Um, I think, is it called rubato? It's played in a rubato style. Basically, he's sort of like, it's got a rhythm, but he's kind of stretching the length of the beats a bit. I mean, the tempo is almost suspended, I suppose, almost like a cadenza or something. Is that what you call it? I'm not too much of an expert on musical terms. Um, and then it kind of picks up again. It seems to have a sort of arch structure, actually, this track. It goes from the Steve Howe bit. By the way, Steve Howe played on one of their later albums, I think, didn't he? Uh, I'm struggling to remember which. Is it Innuendo, was it called? Anyway, doing a similar thing to what Brian May is doing here. Yeah, so it's sort of yeah, it's got the Steve Howe bit played by Brian May, and then it goes into this sort of wild blues section. So I think that uh, I think we have to say at this point that this is Freddie Mercury's first sort of first released track, released to the world. and it already seems to predate Bohemian Rhapsody a bit. It's got this sort of, it's not exactly through composed because it seems to be an arch, I think, but it's um but the connections between the sections are very naturally put together. So it's sort of counterintuitive and intuitive at the same time, which is what you want, if you're trying to write interesting structures. Um, yeah, I mean, Bohemian Rhapsody is completely through composed, of course. It's just a whole. It just goes from one thing to another, from beginning to end. There's no arch in it. It doesn't repeat anything. It just goes. So that's really like then the piece has to be taken as a totality, and I think that's really almost one of the things that Bohemian Rhapsody is famous for. There's another similar track on A Day at the Races called The Millionaire Waltz, which sort of follows the same, um, has a similar sort of structure, and they're pretty remarkable, very unusual for rock music as well. Maybe not so unusual in prog music, but as we've already conceded, there is a sort of connection here with prog. Um, but anyway, yeah, in sum, I love that track, Great King Rat. Um, Now listening back, because there's a new version of this album that's just come out. The original had sort of 4 tracks on side one, I think, and 6 tracks on side two. They've added another track, penultimate track on side one here in the new version, called Mad the Swine. Um, I actually wondered why they'd taken it off in the first place. They said it was something to do with the production. They weren't happy with the production, but I mean, I think it's weird. I often think it's weird when they take tracks off albums. There's a track on Full House by Fairport Convention, which I think is called Poor Will and the Jolly Hangman, if I'm not misremembering. Um, and it was written by Richard Thompson, who vetoed its inclusion apparently last minute. But it's an amazing track, and like it also like the album needed it to be full length. So the album that's as released was sort of unnaturally short and missing one of its key tracks. So I'm not a big fan of that album anyway. And that was like I found out one of the only tracks I really liked on it was taken off and used as a B-side or something or other. But again, restored in the sort of reissued version recently. But yeah, in this case, continuing with the theme of like the length of the songs, Mad the Swine, it's doubly surprising it was taken off because it's the perfect length. I mean, it's like 3 minutes, just over 3 minutes. And if you look at the album uh statistics, side one of Queen One is like 3 minutes shorter than side two. So like it should have been in there. They should have left it in. Although I can sort of see why they took it out because it's kind of shite, actually, this track. It's mostly interesting because it's one of a whole series of references to Jesus. Um, There's a weird thing about this album is that they keep mentioning Jesus, and again, it's on the Freddie stuff really. So I think he was from I can't remember where he was from. Was it Zanzibar or somewhere like that? Anyway, I think his family were um Iranian, right? Zoroastrians. I don't know why they would be discussing Christ. I mean, he could have just been a Christian, but it's not. It's unusual to include so many references to Christ, isn't it, in your music? And at a certain point, he kind of dropped it. He kind of alternates between talking about Christ and talking about like this kind of fairyland Middle Earth thing that he seems to be obsessed with on these first 2 albums. I don't think there's any connection between them. But anyway, Mad the Swine is a weird name for a track. It seems to refer to Jesus himself, um, as if Jesus were the devil for somebody else who didn't recognize his divinity. Or maybe it's not, Mad the Swine is not Jesus, and there's someone else in play. Maybe the devil, I don't know, who is sort of implicitly present in the scene that's being described. A bit like in that awful film by Mel Gibson. What's it called? The Passion of the Christ. But anyway, this sort of reference to Jesus and the Bible and is sort of omnipresent on this album. Above all, on the penultimate track, which is called Jesus. You know, unless well, yeah, unless he was talking about another Jesus, but I think it was basically Jesus Christ. You know. Okay, so we'll leave that track to one side. There's not much to say about it. I don't think it's particularly interesting, and I don't think including it adds anything. Because actually, I prefer the original format because I love Great King Rat, and then the final track on side one on the original version, which we're coming to now. Is My Fairy King, and I think like the run on between Great King Rat and My Fairy King is brilliant on the original album. It almost makes me want to listen to the album just that sequence, because I love Great King Rat, and My Fairy King I think is my favorite track on the album. Say that, you know, straight away. First of all, shout out to the amazing falsetto singing in the introduction, which I guess is by Roger Taylor, who has an amazing voice. It's a completely different kind of voice to Freddie Mercury's voice, but you know the interplay between their voices is really an important part of the Queen sound, and Brian May's as well, although he doesn't have quite such a refined voice, I don't think. Um, he's got more of a what I would call a Canterbury voice. There you are. What about that for a reference? Um, Now, going back to what I was saying before, I think My Fairy King is sort of an even closer early approximation of what would later be the sort of Bohemian Rhapsody composition style, or Millionaire Waltz, you know, because this track is completely through composed. There's no arch. There's no, you know, reiteration of previous themes. Um, and I think it's amazing. I think this works amazingly, this track. It's an absolute highlight on the album, I think. And actually, because of the lyrics, My Fairy King, because it's about, you know, sort of elven land, um, I think it actually sort of precipitates side two of Queen two, which is a kind of um sort of longer conceptual piece. I think actually it's sort of a medley really, but it does have themes that are repeated, I think. And at least like the lyrics are all connected up. So it's almost like Queen have almost done a sidelong prog epic, you know, on Queen 2. But the themes and the mood and the kind of general compositional style are very close to this My Fairy King, right? So they're they're very heavily related. You can see a sort of continuity between the two of them. Um, and I think side two of Queen Two is a brilliant sequence of tracks. Definitely should definitely check that out if you haven't already. Um, I don't need to give you advice, do I? You probably already checked it out. Anyway, otherwise you wouldn't even be here. Um, yeah, and the concept in both cases is related to sort of Freddie's dream life, isn't it? His imaginary world, you know, of elven kings and queens and you know fairy kings and queens and things. Sort of quite traditional English motifs, actually. But I don't think that Freddie Mercury wasn't actually English, was he? Even though he was, you know, yeah, I think brought up in England, I guess. You know, lived in England for most of his life, obviously. Um, but I don't think he was born in England. But he obviously identified with, you know, the English, um, you know, sort of like the imaginary literary land and literary landscape of Great Britain, you know, the British Isles, to some extent. Now, I sort of tried to work out the structure of this track. Like I tried to make a list of the structural sections, but it's so difficult because it's so complicated. I mean, it almost sort of seems to approach like I don't know, some of this stuff seems to approach like Jethro Tull style complexity. Not only is it through compose in the sense that it's moving like different thing to another, um, but it's also like they're incredibly complex for head arrangements, i.e., for things which are not written down. I mean, I don't even know how they remembered half of it, you know, as is also the case with Jethro Tull. I mean, how did they remember, you know, Passion Play and stuff when they were playing it live? I can never work that out. Um, so yeah, I gave up trying to write down the structure, but I think it's probably like there's three moments I'd like to highlight, which I particularly love. I like the sort of beautiful, like folk song at the beginning, with its really sort of sophisticated, quite exciting mood. I don't know how they've quite managed to conjure it. It's a nice tune, but it's the way that the tune works with the counterpoint and the different harmonic elements that make this section so interesting. Not to mention beautiful. My fairy king. This whole bit, I think is wonderful. Um, Once again, a couple of minutes in, there's a Rick Wakeman-ish sort of development. Goes down to a slow four. It sounds like we're listening to listen Legends of King Arthur at one point. This is like a really lovely contrasting section. Almost reminds me of the funky bit in Echoes by Pink Floyd, in the sense that we've got like a sort of, we're going from an A section to a B section. The B section is specifically chosen to contrast, to provide a bit of fun, sort of bit of fun and energy after a quite serious opening section. I suppose that's the connection, isn't it? You can tell I'm thinking out loud here for most of it. I've got some notes, but I'm improvising a little bit here. And then the third bit I wanted to mention was it all breaks down at one point and it goes into a piano song kind of break. Someone, da 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 da. Then it goes, Mother Mercury, look what you've done to me. Look what they've done to me, which is absolutely beautiful. Again, I'm sorry to keep saying this, but this sounds like an early Bohemian Rhapsody to me. It's just so, the writing is so inspired. Not to mention that Mother Mercury, look what they've done to me, which may have been a reference to his mother, I guess, is a sort of slightly melancholic line. And in that sense, it's like a lyrical precursor to Bo Rap, right? And you realize at that point that Bohemian Rhapsody is not actually like a metaphor necessarily for Freddie Mercury. It's like his life, which is something that it might seem obvious, but it wasn't obvious to me. I only realized it actually when I was listening to this track. So there you go. Yeah, so I think that's all I've got to say on that track. But as I say, if you haven't checked this out, check it out because it is so good, that track. Then we go into another Freddie Mercury track on side two begins, Liar, called. And again, this is another sort of compendium piece, with Christian overtones again. It's quite good fun, and it sort of extends the run of good, it's sort of interestingly composed tracks on the album, I suppose. But I have to say, this is slightly less interesting than the previous two tracks for my taste. So for me, the album is sort of coming to an end here, which is always a risk. But it's sort of been working for me so far. And I suppose another. Well, again, I would say this is an extremely complex track. Probably the most complex so far in terms of the structure. And it's also extremely eclectic. Almost like, again, Freddie's made a decision to do that. Like he's going to include as many different feels as he can. I mean, it even goes into sort of a slave song at one point. And then it goes into like one of the hardest rocking riffs I think I've ever heard. And so it's very complex and eclectic. And yeah, if where that works, I think Queen are your band, Where it doesn't work, you don't enjoy it, and it can even be slightly irritating, as I've already said, because it's nice to be ambitious, isn't it? But if you're ambitious and you fall on your face, then it's almost worse than keeping your head down. This is not advice I would necessarily give to a young person. But anyway, yeah. The other thing I wanted to say about this track is that I noticed is that this track Liar includes the full range of sort of dynamic vocal techniques that Queen, later became famous for, particularly between the three singers. I mean, my God, it's all here, really. All of the sounds that they became famous for later on. So it's a funny, I mean, I keep saying this, but this is a funny sort of uh, balance in this album between uh, a lot of the arrangement techniques, which almost never change for the whole in their entire future of their career, um, but without actually quite reaching the level of inspiration that they reach later on. I think that's not quite true because some of these tracks are really inspired, but I think that they when they're very inspired, they're too complex to quite capture the public mind, I would say. Um, Although I suppose you could also say that about Bohemian Rhapsody, so maybe I'm contradicting myself there because Bohemian Rhapsody is incredibly complex, isn't it? But I think the success of Bohemian Rhapsody is partly due to its incredible quality, but also due to something that happened um, in the sort of the marketing of it at a certain point in British pop history. They sort of put a video together for it and things like that, and they managed to market it right, I think. But anyway, whatever. Um, as I say, what strikes me about this album is the sort of slight imbalance between this is what's called uneven historical development. Uh, if I can go into a Tim's pedantry corner for a second, in his history of the Russian Revolution, uh, Leon Trotsky at the beginning talks about uneven and combined development. It's important theory in part of Marxist theory. And Trotsky's conclusion was that the basic law of all historical development is unevenness, whereas previously it had been thought to be combination. He said it's unevenness. That's to say, like uneven intellectual development, historical development, social development, what it is actually the norm. It's stranger when it all comes together, actually, as it did on Bohemian Rhapsody, for example. Um, I don't know whether Trotsky would have liked Bohemian Rhapsody. Anyway, we can only guess. Okay, good. So that's that track done. Next one is The Night Comes Down, which I believe they've just re-released as a single. Again, we're back to the Brian May, run of tracks here, which I like less. No offense, to Brian. I like the arrangements here again. I think the drum beat emerging from that chaotic introduction, I think it's really cool. I think that's a really nice arrangement moment, sort of arrangement production moment, I would say. Arrangement slash production moment. Um, I just don't like the tune of this song very much. And I think really that's crucial for me. I think perhaps because I have a prejudice towards vocal music, basically, as I sort of made clear on the last episode on Led Zeppelin, I think. Um, and I think that so I think that you've got to have a nice tune to hang all of these interesting arrangement points on, at least in the case of a group like Queen, I would say. Sometimes arrangement slash production points can be interesting in themselves, but they're not here because that's not really why we're listening to this album, if you know what I mean. It's not really why the audience has tuned in, I don't think. Um, I said it's a Brian May run of tracks. Actually, the next track is track 3 on side 2 is actually a Roger Taylor track, Modern Times Rock and Roll. I mean, this is a total all out balls to the wall rocker. Excuse my French. And because he is a real rocker, at least at this stage, Roger Taylor. All of the stuff he's writing is very heavy. Um, so it's all out. It's less than 2 minutes long, which so according to my theory that I've set out on a number of occasions, it can't possibly be a bad track because you know how bored is it possible to get in 1 minute 50? Um, well, quite bored, as the career of the Ramones probably proves. Um, Okay, so this is a complete contrast to the other stuff on the album. Um, the harmony here is all over the place. I don't know what they're doing. But it's all right. It works well enough. I mean, it's not a great track. Um, I can't remember what his first great track was, Roger Taylor. He must have had one. I mean, he wrote Under Pressure, didn't he, basically later on, and Radio Gaga and various other amazing tracks. Um, but again, a bit like Brian May, I don't think he'd quite hit his stride yet here. Has got an amazing voice though, completely different to Freddie's voice, but equally interesting, I think, curiously enough. Next comes another May track, Son and Daughter. It's another May rocker. I mean, this is again an all-out rocker. They're not fast like the Roger Taylor track, which is really fast. It's a sort of grinder, this one. Um, Almost Black Sabbath, heavy. Well, maybe even heavier. I mean, this is a really this could be played by Black Sabbath. This main riff here, um, and I don't think it's as good as Black Sabbath or Led Zeppelin or whatever. It's not quite as doesn't grab me quite as much the riff as a good Tony Iommi riff. I mean, the things with riffs is that you either like them or you don't. I think. I mean, an individual one of them. I mean, and in this case, I don't like it, but I can see what they're trying to do. And they're trying to lay down some markers. I think, with more or less success. Penultimate track is another Mercury one. Now this is the weirdest Mercury song on the album, I think. I can't really get my head around this track. I don't like it very much. This is the one called Jesus, which, as I pointed out earlier, is about Jesus. Um, uh, yeah, I think this is his weakest song. So I think the album for me, the album's really petering out at this point. Um, I mean, the slow 6/8 time. Oh, see the Lord Jesus, sort of foreshadows someone to love, I suppose, off A Day at the Races. Um, Apart from that, I mean, I'm not really sure what style this song is in. It's not quite gospel. Um, but it doesn't sound like anything else. But that's not really again with Queen. That's not necessarily a good thing, you know. It's not quite clear to me what they're grasping for here. Um, it's sort of it seems like an attempt to do something sort of almost self-consciously camp, which almost puts me in mind again of like the cover and the whole sort of queering thing. Like I wonder whether actually at this point what they're doing is when they sing about Jesus in that very, spiritually open-hearted way, as Christians tend to do. I wonder whether what they think that they're doing is sort of again sort of participating in the kind of glam movement, the sort of gender bending, kind of campy glam idiom. I'm not sure. I don't think it works anyway. I mean, I don't think it works either in its own terms or as an attempt to, fit in with some wider aesthetic. Um, but anyway, I think this is a rather, let's say, it's a slightly tragic end uh to this album, I think. I mean, there is an up moment because there's a sort of coda to the album, which is Seven Seas of Rhye, right? Um, I suppose the thing is that this version, Seven Seas of Rhye, is not the definitive version because they did another version for the end of Queen 2, which for the life of me, I don't know why it's on Queen 2. I think they should have issued it as a standalone single because doesn't fit into the second side of Queen 2, which already has an ending. And then it's like they put the same coda on the first two albums, just in different formats for no apparent reason. Um, because this is the instrumental version where they just take the opening riff and then they just jam on it for a bit. And I think that Seven Seas of Rhye is a brilliant track, as I've already said. But this doesn't really go anywhere, this one. And I don't think it really adds anything. So as I said before, this is, the album ends tragically, but not in the sense tragically in the sense of being particularly just bad. I mean, it's tragic in the sense that it was always going to end badly, because they haven't quite found their métier yet. Um, but I think it's coming. I think it's coming soon. I think it starts actually with Queen too, but maybe that's a debate for another day. So I hope I've said enough to, you know, um, get the conversation started, but we'll see. And thanks for listening, or indeed watching. And remember to like and subscribe. We're always grateful for your participation in our conversations. And have a good whatever period of time is about to um, uh, befall you. And I'll see you next time. Thank you. Goodbye.